Good evening, everybody. Professor Benny Gruen here. I am an adjunct professor at Touro University Worldwide in the Bachelor's of Social Work program. And in this PowerPoint presentation, this lecture, I'm going to present to you Margaret Mahler's stages and some interesting mnemonics to help you easily memorize the stages. Okay, let's jump in. Okay, Margaret Mahler's theory of child development. Okay, so who was Margaret Mahler? So Margaret Mahler was a doctor and a famous psychoanalyst, usually put in the Sigmund Freud camp, and she specialized in infant emotional development, and she developed the separation individuation theory, which we're going to spend the bulk of this presentation discussing. The idea of that theory is that a baby that's born is very much connected to its mother, and then over the first 2 years plus of the baby's life, the baby begins to separate from the mother, become more of an individual, hence the name separation individuation theory. And that's what she studied. This is a book that somebody wrote about her. I put it here so you'll have to see how she looked. Okay, let's jump in. So why study Mahler? I always like to pose this question to my students. When we study a topic in psychology, ask ourselves, why is this topic important? Who cares how a baby separates from their mother? And one answer is that in order for a child to develop properly, Mahler believed that the child has to go through these stages successfully. Otherwise, the child can have problems later on in life. We'll see soon, as we discuss this in particular stages, the child has to feel safe and secure as they individualize, as they separate from their mother. They have to feel secure and safe, looking behind their shoulders and seeing, hey, my mother is still there, my caregiver is still there. That is crucial for healthy development. So therefore, parents, caregivers need to know this so that they can maximize the chances for their child to be successful. Okay, so what were Mahler's stages? So there were three main stages. I like to refer to them as six. So the autism stage is first. Then there's the symbiotic or symbiosis stage. Then the third stage has four substages. So the third stage is separation individuation, which is kind of the overarching theme of Mahler's work. But that's really in itself is four stages. There's differentiation, practicing, rapprochement, and object constancy. I pronounce rapprochement funny just because when I was a social work student, we were saying it in a funny way to help be more memorable. So pardon me if I continue to pronounce it that way. So each of these stages, again, so you have autism, symbiosis, and I'm just going to leave out the separation, individuation. I'm just going to focus on the four substages. So we have autism, symbiosis, differentiation, practicing, and rapprochement. So what are these stages? So when a child is in the autistic stage, that's when a baby is just born. They're mostly sleeping, very minimal functioning. It might even remind you of severe autism spectrum disorder, where the child is not really able to function all that well. Then the child moves on to the symbiotic stage, where the baby begins to move around a little bit more, not physically move around. I don't mean like crawling, that'll come later, but the baby begins to realize that it's got some kind of life in it, but it does feel very much united with its mother. This begins to change as we enter the four substages of separation individuation. The baby begins to really start to separate from the mother. And it starts with differentiation, which basically is when the baby realizes, hey, I'm nursing from this person, or I'm drinking a bottle from this person. I am not the same as this person. Sometimes the differentiation stage is referred to as hatching because the baby is hatching out of its shell, finally beginning to differentiate from the mother. Next comes practice, where the child actually practices, physically puts into practice this differentiation, starts crawling around, perhaps starts walking. The age of 10 to 16 months, many toddlers already can start to walk. Then comes rapprochement, which is when even though the child is walking away from the mother, it's constantly looking over its shoulder. Oh, mommy or daddy or whoever it is still there. I feel safe and secure. And finally, 24 or 36 months, give or take, the child develops object constancy, that the object, the mother, is constantly here. They can feel secure that I go away and I know my mother will be there when I get back. Okay, so in the next few slides, I'm going to present my approach for how to remember these stages, because right now some of these words seem tough and very hard to memorize. Okay, so the first hint I'm going to share is the one I developed when I was a social work student. I had a neighbor whose name was Mahler, a very, very friendly guy. And I used to joke, my friend Mahler is ASD Pro. ASD Pro. And letters ASD PRO each one of those are going to stand for one of the stages. And it happens to be ASD stands for autism spectrum disorder. So that is very easily, very, very helpful to remind us that the first stage of A is autistic. Then the S is symbiotic. If you watch a lot of Spider-Man cartoons, I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of a symbiote living off someone else. S, symbiotic, that's the second stage. D, differentiation. Like we said, the child begins to realize they are different. P is practice. The child begins practicing to move away. R, rapprochement, where the child reapproaches or looks over their shoulder at their mom, right, or dad or caregiver. And finally, O, for object constancy. Now, ASD Pro. Now, you might not have a friend Mahler, so use Margaret Mahler, but I had a friend Mahler, so it worked out well. So again, ASD Pro. He was very pro ASD. He was very pro people who had autism spectrum disorder, and that helped me for my social work exam memorize the 6 stages. If that doesn't work for you, I'm going to try to introduce a little bit more of a mnemonic technique that I developed more recently. And to do that, I used Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, not the entire movie. I focused fully on the memorable scene of Aunt Marge for Margaret, of her blowing up and floating away. And let's jump in. Okay, so I used Aunt Marge because her name is, I think, Marjorie. But anyway, it's close enough. Margaret. And here you have her blown up and being shipped in the mail by the owl. And that can remind you of Margaret Mahler. If you recall from the books and video, that she really liked to raise dogs. So that's her dog on the bottom. The dog that she brings, his name is Ripper. And we'll see soon why that is relevant for the mnemonic. Okay, so I have a couple of different parts of this scene that we're going to go through to help us remember. Okay, in this scene, Vernon tells his sister Marge that Harry is in St. Brutus's. I'll give you a quote from the book. St. Brutus's, said Uncle Vernon promptly. It's a first-rate institution for hopeless cases. So Uncle Vernon was calling Harry basically severely autistic. So this can remind you that the first stage is the autistic stage. Then Aunt Marge starts, remember the book, starts making fun of Harry's parents. And he calls him unemployed, basically calling Harry's father a symbiote, someone living off of society. I'll give you a quote from the book. As I expected, said Aunt Marge, taking a huge swig of brandy and wiping her chin on her sleeve. A no-account, good-for-nothing, lazy scrounger who... And Harry then gets angry and, you know what happens. But that is the symbiotic stage. Next, because of Harry's reaction, Aunt Marge begins to blow up. And she begins to grow out and differentiate. She's very different than everybody else, or perhaps hatching, because she's kind of growing out of her clothing, and her buttons are bursting off. I'll give you a quote from the book. Next second, several buttons burst from her tweed jacket and pinged off the walls. She was inflating like a monstrous balloon, her stomach bursting free of her tweed waistband. So basically, she's hatching or differentiating herself. The next stage is practicing, because Uncle Vernon tries, right? When you practice, you try to do something. He tries to get her down. Actually, in the scene of the video, it's pretty pathetic. He doesn't really do too much. But anyway, I think the book gives it a little bit of a better effort. But Vernon is practicing, trying to get her down. That's the practicing stage. Ultimately, he's not successful, and Marge is floating away. But the dog Ripper tries to jump onto Vernon, trying to get down Marge. And Ripper actually sounds like rapprochement. And Ripper is trying to reapproach or reconnect, reapproach his caretaker, Aunt Marge. So that can remind you the next stage is rapprochement. And finally, Aunt Marge, this is not in the book, this is only in the movie, but Aunt Marge is floating away. She is like a floating object. But even though she floated away, we know, the reader knows that she still exists. In fact, she comes up in later books, so she obviously survived this, and it's clear in the book that they rescued her. So this is the final stage. Let's run through this again, because if you watch this clip, this clip's on YouTube of this scene with Marge, it should go pretty clearly. First, you have Uncle Vernon bashing Harry and saying he's a St. Brutus student. That's the autistic stage. Aunt Marge bashing Harry's parents and saying his parents are symbiotes, so they leech off society. That's the symbiotic stage. Then you have her hatching, her differentiating herself. That's the differentiation stage. Then you have Aunt Vernon trying or practicing, trying to save her. That's the practicing stage. You have Ripper trying to reconnect with Marge. That's rapprochement, where the child looks back and makes sure that their caretaker is still there. And finally, you have Aunt Marge, who now turns into a giant balloon, an object, but she is still there, hence object constancy. And remember ASD Pro, that's the 6 stages, Mahler, ASD Pro. and the Aunt Marg scene, and hopefully that'll help you remember all 6 of Margaret Mahler's stages. All the best, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this video. Take care.